For being one of the two remaining ships sunk in the attack on Pearl Harbor, USS Utah is quite often forgotten in comparison to her more famous cousin, Arizona. Even her much smaller memorial is only open to those with military ID, while Arizona's is quite famously open to the public. It's a shame, really. While stripped of her cannons and fitted with an eclectic selection of smaller weapons, while used as a target ship and anti-aircraft trainer, certainly no longer a combat ship and a waste of the torpedoes used to sink her, Utah still has a story to tell, even if that story did end with her partially raised to clear the harbor and promptly left in place to rust away. Forgotten by most and only really known to those who study Pearl Harbor, Utah slips by most people when talking about what ships were sunk that fateful day. Before we can come to that, though, it is important to go over her history. As the second of the Florida-class dreadnoughts, Utah began life as the sixth American dreadnought in general. Her class was the third American dreadnought design, and the first that could really stretch its wings, as it were. The South Carolinas, as I went over in their video, were a mess of compromises to appease Congress and to a lesser extent the Naval Board. They wanted smaller ships and less costly ones, and they got it in the form of slow, somewhat outdated dreadnoughts. The Delaware, by contrast, was mostly an attempt to fix the issues with her predecessors. She had more guns, she was longer and more stable, and she was definitely faster. All of these improvements were necessary and would carry over to the Floridas, which were themselves a direct improvement, if a less drastic one, on the Delawares. While I'll go over the Florida class in more detail in a later video, I'll at least cover the basics of Utah's design here. As built, Utah would have displaced about 22,000 tons as her standard displacement, and about 23,000 at full load. This does put her on the heavier side for a dreadnought, as opposed to a super dreadnought. Most of that increase in weight over Delaware, which was about 2,000 tons, coming in an increased beam. This improves stability, but that's only a side effect. It was actually done to change the layout of her boiler rooms, which just had the happy side effect of increasing her beam and stability. In terms of her main battery, she was identical in number of guns, caliber of guns, and layout of her turrets to the Delawares. She carried 10 12-inch guns and 5 twin turrets, 2 super firing on the bow, a single turret directly aft of her superstructure, and the final 2 back-to-back on her stern. One of the other notable differences in comparison to her predecessor was in switching to a more powerful 5-inch gun, carrying 16 of the things. A weapon that would remain the secondary battery of choice right through the end of the standard-type battleships. She also had the obligatory underwater torpedo tubes, in this case 2 of them. It should be noted her armor belt was an older style layout in comparison to the standards, ranging from 8 to 11 inches in thickness, with distributed armor covering vulnerable parts of the hull. And, as is pretty usual for USN battleships at this point, Utah also had 2 lattice masts of dubious utility. In terms of speed, she can make 21 knots on 4 screws, with 12 coal-fired boilers, keep that in mind for later, producing about 28,000 shaft horsepower. With that out of the way, we can move on to service history, of which there isn't a whole lot to talk about really, in common with many American warships of her generation. Laid down on March 9th, 1909, launched on December 23rd of the same year, and commissioned in August of 1911, Utah's construction period was nothing special. Wasn't slow, wasn't fast, pretty average. Her service would continue in this theme, at least at first. It wouldn't be until 1914 that Utah, and her sister Florida, would actually see anything exciting. In this case, they were the first capital ships on scene during the latest stint of American interventionism in Mexico. In the Second Battle of Veracruz, Utah and Florida put ashore quite a bit of sailors and Marines between them, and while the specifics of this battle are out of the scope of this video, suffice it to say that her men distinguished themselves in it. Following this, Utah's career reverted to boring peacetime training and the like until the United States entered World War I. At this point, as Utah and her sister were still coal-fired, they were both sent to the UK to help support the Royal Navy. While Florida got the honor of joining the 6th Battle Squadron of the Grand Fleet, Utah would instead be based in Ireland for convoy escort duty. Just exactly what she was protecting convoys from is an open question, since a battleship is not an anti-submarine warship, and the odds of Germany getting surface raiders out in late 1918 are pretty slim, but at least she got to do something different, I guess. With the end of the Great War, Utah returned to the United States and her usual duties once more. Other than a brief period where she got to be flagship for celebrations of the Peruvian War of Independence. Flagship of the American squadron at the festivities, anyway. In doing this, she would eventually visit just about every country in South America with a coastline before returning home via Cuba. At which point she and her sister, as the oldest American battleships retained with the signing of the Washington Naval Treaty, went in for modernization. Well, technically they were just the oldest retained as combat warships. USS North Dakota, one of the Delawares, got to stick around for a bit as a target ship. Also keep that in mind. The modernization that Utah underwent was, understandably, not quite as drastic as later refits to the standards. As one of the oldest battleships still in service, it was focused more on converting her to oil-firing boilers and improving her protection. Furthermore, this was a modernization in the 1920s, when it might still have seemed possible that new battleships could be built somewhat soon. As such, her modernization consisted of the aforementioned replacement of her coal-firing boilers with oil-fired ones, in this case taken from the canceled South Dakota and Lexingtons, drastically increasing her available power, while also bringing her in line with the rest of the battleships. It also saw her reduce from 2 funnels to 1, pretty drastically changing her silhouette, which continued with the removal of one of her lattice masts for a far more simple pole mast. That being said, as another sign of her limited refit, she retained her forward lattice mast and would never at any point receive a tripod like the standards. The remainder of the modernization focused mostly around changing up her secondary battery, removing some of her guns and moving the other ones up to her superstructure, and torpedo bulges being fitted to improve her protection. The new boilers came in handy in this regard, since the bulges didn't actually adversely impact her speed, at least not that much. This was only ever going to be a stopgap measure, though. Utah would only see a handful of years of service in this refit before, in line with treaty restrictions again, she would be taken from full service in 1931. While her sister would be scrapped, Utah would be converted into a radio-controlled target ship, replacing the aforementioned North Dakota in this role. This mostly consisted of removing all her weapons, but not her turrets, giving her a somewhat unique look in this period, as well as fitting various radio-controlled systems, making her into the biggest radio-controlled toy boat up to that point in history. Okay, bad jokes aside for the moment. In this guise, Utah was a very useful ship. She would train many crews in naval gunnery, and many pilots in dive and torpedo bombing and strafing attacks, which would prove to be of critical importance later on in the Pacific War, and to a lesser extent the Atlantic War. She also sometimes served as a training tool for submarine crews as well. Being a giant target was the kind of role that most designers would probably not want for their pride and joy, but it was good service, and Utah performed it admirably. At least until she began to go through several further refits, admittedly while she was still serving in this role, to also begin training anti-aircraft gunners. She started this by taking aboard a fleet machine gun crew in 1935, and then continued it by being one of the first ships fitted with the then new quad 1.1-inch cannon mount, the Chicago Piano as it was known, for training purposes. She trained both gunners and aviators in this role. In continuing this, she would eventually start picking up an eclectic mix of 5-inch guns for further improved anti-aircraft training. The culmination of this coming in late 1941, when she went into refit once again, adding yet more of those 5-inch guns, as well as minor refits to her power plant. These guns, in both open mounts and in mounts that looked torn right off a destroyer, were fitted atop her old turrets in one of the more hodgepodge kind of layouts for weapons, even compared to Wyoming. But as a training ship, it really hardly mattered, since she wasn't going to be sailing into combat blazing away with 5-inch guns. The problem is, following this refit, she would be based out of Pearl Harbor, and, in fact, be based there during the Japanese attack. For all of her time spent training anti-aircraft duties, and all the weapons fitted on her, Utah would be caught just as flat-footed as the rest of the Pacific Fleet when Japanese aircraft appeared over the harbor. Within the first few minutes of the attack, 6 torpedoes were dropped at her. The impulsive Japanese pilots saw what appeared to be a serving battleship and attacked what was instead a target ship with a bare handful of training weapons. She was caught completely unprepared for the attack, hit by 2 torpedoes, and promptly began to sink. The other 4 torpedoes missed her, with one of them hitting the nearby USS Raleigh. The torpedoes that did hit Utah instantly doomed her. Water began to fill her hull, and the heavy timber reinforcements placed on her deck to prepare her for bombing practice further destabilized her, while also making it difficult for her crew to get out of her capsizing hull. Within 15 minutes, Utah had rolled over and stuck fast in the mud of the harbor. The Japanese would ignore her from this point on, save for strafing her crew as they struggled to get into her hull to save some of their crewmates left below deck. Utah would lose 6 officers and 52 men in the attack, one of whom, Chief Water Tender Peter Tomich, would receive the Medal of Honor for remaining at his post to ensure her boilers were secured. In the aftermath of the attack, Utah would be taken out of service entirely. Old, ruined by damage, and surplus to requirements, with USS Wyoming able to take up her role of anti-aircraft trainer, there was little enough reason to salvage her wreck. An attempt was made to right her the same way as done on Oklahoma across Ford Island, but Utah simply slid in the mud and drifted closer to the island. The Navy promptly gave it up and decided she was enough out of the way, and left her wreck in place, where it remains to this day, silently rusting away, with some above water and the majority just underneath the surface. As I mentioned, quite unlike Arizona, Utah only has a small memorial, one open only to military members. I can understand why. She doesn't have anywhere near the casualty counts or fame of Arizona. Fewer people would care to visit her to begin with. Still, for being the only other wreck of a battleship in the harbor, I do wish that Utah was remembered by more people. Her service wasn't glamorous by any means, but I feel she deserves at least that much. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and remember to like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.